Tom Wilson was listening to all of that, Senior Research Fellow in the Security and Extremism Unit at the Policy Exchange. Tom, good afternoon to you.
Hello.
Your thoughts on those essentially equivalents of IPP, which have been stopped now, haven't they?
Well, I think that what we could see on top of what the government has already proposed, which places a strong emphasis on parole boards, which is actually something the Policy Exchange recently called for. What we could also see is perhaps something similar to what they have in Australia, which would be, it's referred to often as a post-sentence detention, where once someone who has committed a terrorism offence has served their full time in prison, they would go before a parole board and they could be kept in prison, but not indefinitely, perhaps for up to 2 years, based on an assessment of how much risk they pose. So that would be another solution.
Is the skill of the risk assessment something that needs to be looked at?
Well, I think that trying to assess risk is probably similarly difficult to trying to de-radicalise people. They're closely related in trying to assess what somebody's thought process is. But if we think of the case of Sudesh Aman, the attacker in Streatham, the intelligence that was used to put armed guards monitoring him, to put that in place, that intelligence could have been used instead to have kept him inside prison for longer, because clearly they had a very high level of risk to have monitored him to that degree.
And we are hearing that intelligence, or I may be surmising here, but we've heard that in prison he spoke readily to fellow prisoners, or we are told that he spoke readily to fellow prisoners about wanting to kill an MP, or to, in his way, he made reference to Joe Cox, who was murdered. That's a level of, that's clearly a man who has not been de-radicalised in prison.
Well, exactly. And I think that the 3 attacks that the UK has witnessed in recent months all point to something going very badly wrong in prison. So there was obviously the Usman Khan attack at London Bridge. There's been an attack inside a prison in Whitemoor, and now this attack. And all of these are either recently released people or people who are actually in prison. The government looked at this back in 2016. They had a review of Islamist extremism in prison, but it looks as though very few of the recommendations have actually been put in place. And perhaps there's an entire culture within the prison system that just isn't proactive enough to dealing with this issue.
We've got something of a glimpse, haven't we, given the events on Sunday? We all, as ordinary citizens, had something of a glimpse of what surveillance and monitoring of these individuals looks like, given that we've learned that up to 20 armed officers, plainclothes officers, surveillance operators were on his case, not all at the same time, but over a period of a week or so. We're getting a glimpse into the effort it takes to contain these people. And the truth is, thank goodness nobody was killed, and nobody should have been stabbed, of course. But the truth is that he was brought to heel very quickly because of those armed officers, wasn't he?
Well, he was, but what was put in place in this particular case would be unsustainably expensive, essentially, to do for all of the people who are coming up for release. Yeah. It's much cheaper and it's much more effective, where legally possible, to keep terrorists in prison for longer. So I think the government is right to place this particular emphasis on sentencing, but also to look at parole boards to make a proper assessment of people before they're released. But as we saw with Usman Khan, it can be called wrong. People thought that Usman Khan was appropriate to attend a conference in London to talk about people who've been de-radicalised, when he was clearly a highly radicalised individual himself.
How do we deal with that naivety? It's a word I've used a lot this week about our national response to these individuals. I think there is a naivety there.
Sure. I mean, an example of what would seem to be naivety or perhaps timidity within, going back to the prison system again, would be the lack of the use of separation units, which were recommended by Ian Akerson in 2016. And the government had these special separation units created in prisons so that even if we're not very good at the moment at de-radicalising people, at least we could try and stop extremist prisoners from radicalising fellow inmates. And the idea was to put them in these separate centres. But from what we know, these units are going basically unused. They're basically empty. And given the reports that we've had of what's been going on in prisons with extremists, it seems unforgivable not to make use of a facility that's on hand. So that would be one thing, to start using measures.
What happens in those isolation units or separation units? Who's separated from whom?
Well, the most extreme prisoners would be put in those units, and the Times carried a story recently about prisoners operating their own Sharia courts, of them self-appointing as emirs inside prisons. All of that kind of activity could be broken up by placing these people in these separate units. The question about what happens to them then is far more complicated, because you can certainly try and have de-radicalization schemes, but the truth is we know very little about how effective those are. Clearly there's evidence that they're not always effective, and most of the schemes that we use are very new, so we haven't had time yet to see what works and what doesn't. So you could try and de-radicalize those people, but there's no guarantee.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Good to talk to you. Tom Wilson, Senior Research Fellow in Security and Extremism in the Security and Extremism Unit at the Policy Exchange.